Welcome to this week's Bible reading and my reflections. This week's reading is from Luke's Gospel, chapter 12, starting at verse 13. Someone in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Jesus replied, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" Then he said to them, "Watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. A man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man produced a good crop. He thought to himself, "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "This is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with anyone who stores up things for himself, but is not rich towards God." Australia's recently elected federal government is the most diverse in Australia's history. It's beginning to reflect the diversity that is present in the population in terms of its First Nations peoples, its genders, its ethnicities, backgrounds, and religions. This is surely a good thing, that more people in our society feel they have a voice and are truly represented. And a wider range of people can see that they too can make it into Parliament, should they so choose to become politicians. There are no bars to them becoming members of Parliament. If others like me can do it, I can do it too. A phrase that keeps coming up in articles that I've been reading about underrepresented groups becoming members of Parliament and entering other careers is, "You can't be what you can't see." In other words, you need to see people like you in roles to encourage you to be what they are. Is that statement true? It's certainly helpful and an encouragement to see people like you doing a job or a role that you're considering. Before I was ordained, many of the churches I attended had male, big, extrovert personalities leading them. And then Richard was appointed vicar, and he had a much quieter, more reflective personality. At about this time, I felt God was nudging me towards ordination, and seeing someone like Richard doing the role was an encouragement for me to explore further. I felt his personality was more similar to mine than previous extrovert vicars. But there are a few exceptional people who are what they can't see. They are brave people who are trailblazers, who are the first of their kind to take on a role. So what do we make of God's call in the Old Testament to his people to be holy? So in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 2, this is what God says: "Be holy, because I, the Lord your God, am holy." How could God's people be holy when the only example of holiness, God, was not seen except in fleeting encounters by a few individuals? How could they be what they couldn't see? Well, God didn't leave his people floundering. He told them that he had a role in making them holy. He made his people holy by choosing them out of all the other peoples who inhabited the world, and by giving his people laws about just about every aspect of human life. Apparently there are 613 laws. Fortunately, we have a summary of these laws. We are to love the Lord our God with our whole being, and we are to love others as we love ourselves. That is how God's people could be holy and reflect the holiness of God, even though God wasn't visible to them. But then God became visible. He became visible when he took on human flesh and lived a human life in the person of Jesus. We get to see holiness in the person of Jesus. We see what it is like to live a holy life. Many people living at the time in his region saw Jesus and heard his words. We get to see him by reading the accounts we have of his ministry in the Gospels. Seeing Jesus gives us a much better chance of being holy because we can be what we can see, or we can see what we aspire to be. Over the last few weeks, I've spoken many times of my conviction that we as a church are to be like Jesus. We are to be holy, but not in the way that most people in our wider community would understand that word. I think that word now has got negative connotations, sort of holier than thou or a holy huddle, pious people, people who are religious, but not in a good way. Holy people are sometimes thought of as hypocrites when their veneer fades. Holiness is not a quality to which many outside the church community would aspire. A life of love, possibly yes. A holy life, not so much. For people inside the church, a holy life and a life of love might be the same. In the last couple of weeks, I've had my attention drawn to the invitation that Jesus offers to all and the reason why he came. So the statement in John's Gospel, chapter 10, verse 10, Jesus says, I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. Jesus himself had that full life. We, through him as God's people, are to have that full life. We, as his ambassadors, are to be those who invite others into that full life. And we are to be seen as people who have that full life so that others can be what they can see. Because how hard it is to be what you cannot see, or it's just easier to be what you cannot see. And living life to the full is living a life loving God with our whole being and loving others in the same way as we love ourselves. One of the things that kept me within the church wanting to find out more as an 11 or 12-year-old was seeing people in the church youth group who had something that I wanted. They had love amongst themselves and for others. I wanted to be what I could see. And what drives people away from the church is so often lack of love, a judgmental hypocrisy. So turning now to our Bible reading. Be on your guard against all kind of greed, says Jesus. What's the problem with greed? It stands in opposition to love. Love is all about giving and generosity and thinking of others. Greed is all about amassing for ourselves. Greed binds us. It dominates our thoughts, our words, and our actions. I want more, so I need to work out how to get more and spend my time doing what it takes to get more. If we are greedy, how then can we live a full life of love for God and love for others? In the reading, Jesus says, a person's life does not consist in the abundance of their possessions. The question that is left unasked but is surely present and which Jesus wants us to think about is, what does a person's life consist of? And Jesus invites us to ponder more by telling us a parable. In my version of the Bible, the NIV, the parable has a title, The Parable of the Rich Fool. The trouble with that title is that we immediately disassociate ourselves from the main character. We're not like him, we're not rich, and we're not foolish. Jesus didn't give his parable a title. So we could give it another title. How about the parable of the wise man who planned sensibly for his retirement? So before his retirement, his land is producing a lot of crops. What should he do with them? It would seem quite prudent, don't you think, to store the crops or to save. So he gets going on a building project to build bigger barns where he can store the surplus and the rest of his goods. Isn't this sensible behavior? Isn't this what wise people do? Isn't that what you would do if you were in his possession? Perhaps it's what we are doing. He's got a future in mind for himself, which isn't too far from many people's plans for retirement, to eat, drink, and be merry. We might add to go on a road trip, to go traveling, to spend time with the family. In order to achieve this, the man needs resources, which will come from storing the good harvests from previous years. I imagine the wealthy people in Jesus's original audience thinking up to this point in the parable, well, this man is just being wise and sensible. Is this a parable giving us an example of how we should behave? And I imagine the poor listening to Jesus's parable thinking, well, the lucky man not having to worry about where his next meal's coming from. If only I could be like him. And then God speaks in the parable. And the first words that God says about the man, to the man, is, "You fool." I think that would have come as a surprise to Jesus's original audience. You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? And that's where the parable ends. Jesus leaves us with something to think about in his final comment. This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God. It begs the question, how can we be rich towards God? What does that mean? Is it loving God with our whole being and loving others as we love ourselves? I have some further questions that arise in my mind. Is it possible to plan for my retirement and build some barns to store up things for myself and my family and be rich towards God? Or do I have to choose one or the other? I'm certainly hearing from the parable that being rich towards God should be my priority. So what are we to do with this warning of Jesus against greed? Should we be telling people in our wider community not to be greedy? I don't think so. We should not be acting as the moral police. This is a teaching for us. It's not intended to make us feel shame or guilt, because it comes from Jesus and he speaks in love. He is pointing out to us what might be preventing us from entering into life in all its fullness. And as we reflect on our lives, we might need to take action and change our priorities so that greed isn't our motivation. We might need to think about how we show love and generosity to others. The reading encourages us as individuals to look at ourselves, but also asks us as a church to look at ourselves. As a church, where and how do we show love and generosity? When our parish council finance working group meet and make decisions, are we motivated by greed? Or do our decisions reflect the love and generosity of God? I think there are encouraging signs at Wyoming Anglican. A while back, earlier on in the year, we knew we needed to spend some $20,000 making repairs to some of our church roof. We didn't have that money in the budget. So the parish council made the decision to launch an appeal amongst the congregation, asking them for donations to pay for this work. And I had drafted the letter ready to go. And then we unexpectedly received a COVID business grant from New South Wales government, which covered the cost of the roof repairs. So the parish council had to decide whether we'd save that money for a rainy day and still ask for donations from the congregation to pay for the roof repairs. The decision was made not to save the grant money for a rainy day. We didn't need more money for the present, so the appeal never happened. The letter wasn't sent out. I'm glad. Had I done so, I feel that we would have been greedy gathering in more than we needed. I'm glad that we're going to be trying something radically different with our hall hirers rent in 2023. We were going to be putting up the rent across the board for all our groups to generate some much needed income. But instead, the parish council agreed to let each group decide if they could be more generous to us. We're asking them to set their own rent for next year, realizing that one or two groups possibly can't afford to pay us anymore. They're going through tough financial times as we are. In this way, I feel we are showing love and generosity to them. We are being more like Jesus. I wonder what you think. Keep praying for our finance working group that we continue to make decisions that are loving and generous and wise, but not greedy. It can be difficult when finances are tight. My hope is that when people see that we are like Jesus, becoming more and more like him, that we do have life in all its fullness, a life of love for God and love for others at its heart, that people want to be what they see we are and have that life for themselves. And that is only possible through the grace of Jesus Christ. Amen.